She didn't know she was signing her own marriage certificate until the pen was already in her hand. The paper on the table looked official. It had a gold seal at the top and a notary stamp at the bottom, and the kind of formal legal language that made her head swim even on a good day. And this was not a good day. This was the day they were going to take her mother's house. The auction was in 4 hours. The debt had accumulated for 6 years, since her father disappeared and stopped sending money, since the medical bills started arriving in envelopes that felt heavier every month, since Nora Walsh had stopped sleeping properly and started keeping a running total in her head of exactly how many days she had left before the ground gave out beneath her. The man sitting across the desk was not the attorney she had called. She understood that now, too late, looking at his face. The kind of face that belonged to someone who had learned to be the most dangerous thing in every room by pretending very convincingly to be ordinary. "What is this?" she said. "A solution," said Mateo Vargas. He slid the paper closer to her across the desk, slowly, the way you'd push something toward a frightened animal, not aggressive, just patient, as if he had all the time in the world, as if the outcome were not in question. "I'm not signing anything I haven't read," Nora said, and she was proud how steady her voice came out, because inside she was running the math again. 4 hours, $50,000, a house her mother had lived in for 31 years. "Then read it," Mateo said. "I'll wait." She read it. Every word. Twice. It was, as it turned out, exactly what he said it was. A marriage contract. Her name, his name, a provision that all debts belonging to one Nora Claire Walsh would be assumed in full by the other party upon signing. Legal, complete, and absolutely insane. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough. Enough to marry me? Enough to need you," Mateo said. And the honesty in it, the flat, unsentimental directness was more unsettling than any lie would have been. "I need a wife. You need $50,000 and somewhere safe to live. This is a transaction. You should think of it like that." "I should think of marrying a stranger like a transaction?" "Yes." Nora looked at the paper, then at him. He had dark eyes and a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, and a neck tattoo that disappeared into the collar of a suit that cost more than her car. She had seen men like him in news articles, in the kind of stories that ran with photographs of city hall steps and lawyers in expensive shoes. She had never expected to be sitting across a desk from one of them, alone, with a pen in her hand. "Why me?" she asked, because she needed the answer before she could do anything else. Mateo was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "Because I need someone who has nothing to lose except what I give her, and someone who, when she looks at me, doesn't see what I need me to be. You're the first person in a very long time who looked at me and saw nothing at all." She hadn't known then what that meant. She learned later, much later, that it was the truest thing he ever said to her. Before going any further, please like and subscribe to this channel, and also comment what city you're watching from. Okay, let's continue. She signed the paper. She told herself it was just a transaction. She was wrong about that, too. The house Mateo took her to was not a house. It was an estate on the northern edge of the city, behind iron gates that opened on a keypad she wasn't given the code to, surrounded by grounds that employed 6 people to maintain. Nora stood in the entrance hall the first evening with her single rolling suitcase and her mother's quilt folded over her arm, and felt, for the first time in her adult life, completely ridiculous. "I'll show you to your room," said a woman named Celia, not warmly, not coldly, in the practiced neutral register of someone who worked for people like Mateo and knew what happened when you formed opinions. Her room was larger than the apartment she'd lived in before her mother's house. It had a sitting area and a window seat and a bathroom with heated floors that she stood on for a long moment in socks, thinking about nothing specific and everything enormous. There was a note on the pillow. The arrangement is simple. You live here, you attend the events I require a wife for, you answer questions with the approved script. Yes, it was fast, but when you know, you know. And return to the estate each night to the silence of a house that had too many rooms and not enough voices. Matteo was rarely there. He worked long hours in an office somewhere downtown, and arrived home late, if at all, and passed through the common rooms with the focused efficiency of a man who did not consider his house a place where he actually lived. He said good morning when they crossed paths, occasionally asked if he needed anything. Once, on a Tuesday afternoon, stood in the kitchen doorway for a full minute watching her make tea without saying anything, and then simply walked away. She didn't know what to do with him, so she did what she'd always done with confusing things. She watched. She watched him check his phone every 7 minutes when he was in the room. She watched him rearrange items on flat surfaces without seeming to realize he was doing it. Keys aligned with the table edge, glasses always at 90 degrees to the coaster. She watched him eat alone, always in his study, and not because he was antisocial, but because he'd clearly forgotten at some point in his life that eating was something people did together. On the 23rd day, she brought 2 plates to his study and set one in front of him without asking. He looked at it, then at her. "What is this?" "Dinner. I made too much." She sat down in the chair across his desk, which was technically not hers to sit in, and started eating as if that's simply what happened now. Matteo looked at his plate for another beat. Then he picked up his fork. He said nothing about it, but when she got up to leave, he said, without looking away from his papers, the pasta was good. It was the nicest thing he'd said to her since the marriage certificate. She was in bed an hour later thinking about it more than she should have been, and that was the first sign, though she didn't recognize it yet, that she was in serious trouble. She found the photograph on day 31. She was dusting the library, not because she was supposed to, but because she needed something to do, and the library had clearly gathered dust since some time before she arrived, and she knocked a leather-bound album from a low shelf, and it fell open, and the photograph was inside the front cover, tucked behind the cardboard, like something hidden rather than stored. It was old, black and white, the edges soft from handling. A man in his 40s, arm around a woman in a summer dress, both of them squinting against what looked like bright sun. The man had dark eyes, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. Nora stared at it for a long time. Then she looked at the back. Elena and Rodrigo, Buenos Aires, 1987. She put it back exactly where she found it, went to her room, sat on the window seat. The man in the photograph had the same jaw as Matteo, the same way of holding his shoulders, but Rodrigo Vargas had been, she ran through what she'd read in those news articles, the ones with City Hall steps and expensive lawyers, dead 10 years, killed in a warehouse fire that 3 different federal agencies had investigated and none of them had ever quite explained. She thought about the photograph for 3 days before she decided what to do with the information. What she decided was nothing. She filed it. She watched. The escalation began on the 40th day when a man appeared at the estate gate at 2 in the afternoon and asked through the intercom to speak to Mrs. Vargas. Nora answered the intercom herself because Celia was out. "Mrs. Vargas," said the man, and something in his voice made every hair on her arms stand up. "You don't know me, but your husband does, and there are things about him I think you deserve to know." She cut the intercom, called Matteo's number. He picked up on the second ring. "There's a man at the gate," she said. "He asked for me by name. He said he knows you." A pause, shorter than she expected from a man who chose his words carefully. "Don't let him in. Don't speak to him again. I'm on my way." "Matteo," she said, before she could stop herself. Who is he? Another pause, different in quality from the first, not strategic, actually uncertain. Old business, Matteo said, and hung up. He was at the estate in 19 minutes, which told her his office was not where she'd imagined. He didn't go to the gate. He came directly to her, which he had never done before, and stood in the entrance hall looking at her with the reading the room expression she'd come to know, and said, "You're all right." It wasn't quite a question. She answered it anyway. "I'm fine. I'm wondering if you're going to tell me what that was about." "No."
"Okay," she said. He blinked. He had clearly expected an argument. "You're not going to push?" "I'm going to wait until you want to tell me," Nora said, which is not the same thing as not caring. It's just understanding the difference between information and trust. She paused. "And you haven't trusted me yet, so." Matteo looked at her for a moment that was longer than usual. Then he said, "The guest house has a better security perimeter than this wing. I'm moving you tonight." "You're not going to tell me why?" "No." "But you're worried." He said nothing, which, she was learning, was Matteo's way of saying yes. That night, unpacking her suitcase in the guest house with its better security perimeter, Nora thought about the man at the gate and the photograph in the library and the 19 minutes it had taken Matteo to drive from wherever he'd actually been, and understood that she was living in the middle of something much larger than a transaction. And the thing that frightened her most, the thing she lay awake thinking about in the dark, was that she was starting to not want to leave. She learned his name 6 days later, not from Matteo, from the man who showed up again, this time at the school where she'd started volunteering on Tuesdays because she needed something to do that was actually hers, and because Matteo had said he didn't care how she spent her days as long as she was back by 6. The man slid into the seat across from her in the teacher's break room, and he was smiling, and she recognized him from the gate. His name was Ciro. He had worked for the Vargas family for 11 years, and he had left 8 months ago because of something he'd seen that he couldn't unsee. He wanted her to understand, he said, what she'd married into. He wanted her to know the truth about the warehouse fire that killed Rodrigo Vargas. "I already know about the fire," Ciro said. "What do you know?" "That it was investigated 3 times and never explained, that it killed Matteo's father, that Matteo was 19 at the time and inherited everything." She held his gaze. "Is that the story you're here to tell me?" "Not exactly," Ciro said. "The story I'm here to tell you is that Matteo Vargas was in that warehouse the night of the fire. He survived, his father didn't, and there has never been a clean explanation for why one of them made it out and the other didn't." Nora was quiet for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know who you're sleeping next to." "We don't sleep next to each other," she said flatly, "and you're giving me an insinuation, not an answer. Why are you really here?" Ciro's smile faded slightly, the rehearsed version dropping to reveal something colder beneath. "Because the man who actually started that fire wants to meet you, and he's going to get what he wants one way or another. I'm offering you a choice about how." She stood up, took her bag, looked at him from above. "Tell whoever you're working for that his intelligence is bad. I'm not Matteo's weakness. I'm a business arrangement. He barely knows my middle name." She paused. "Don't come near this school again." She walked out of the building and to the car she'd been given to use and sat in the driver's seat for 3 minutes before she trusted her hands on the wheel. She was back at the estate by 3. She went to Matteo's study. He was home early, she noticed, and understood now that he had been tracking her location without telling her, and she knocked on the open door and said, "Ciro found me at the school. A man named Ciro who used to work for your family." Every muscle in Matteo's body went still. It was different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness of someone who has just been told something they were dreading. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." "Matteo, sit down." She sat.
He told her things then that he had not told her before. Not all of it. She understood instinctively that she was receiving a curated version of the truth, shaped by what he thought she could handle, which was patronizing and also probably necessary. But she got the shape of it. Ciro was working for a man named Acosta, who had been in competition with the Vargas family for 20 years, and who had 8 months ago made a move that had nearly cost Mateo everything. The move had failed. Acosta had retreated, and now he was back, and he had found the thing he thought was Mateo's most exploitable vulnerability. "He thinks you matter to me," Mateo said. "I'm a business arrangement," Nora said, and she hated how practiced it sounded coming out of her mouth. Something crossed Mateo's face, too fast to read. "Yes," he said, "that's what you are." She went to bed that night with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been lied to by a true thing. The nightmare happened on day 62. She heard him through the wall, a single sharp sound, muffled, the kind that's not a scream but lives in the same category. And she sat up in the dark guest house and sat still for a moment, and then, for reasons she did not fully examine, got up and went to the connecting door between their two sections and knocked. Silence. She knocked again. The door opened. Mateo stood in it, dark circles under his eyes, a glass of water in his hand that he'd clearly poured and not yet drunk, expression arranged carefully into the closed-off default she was learning to read past. She said, "You don't sleep," he said. "I sleep fine." "Mateo." He looked at her for a moment, looked at the water in his hand. Then, in the voice of a man conceding something small in order to hold on to something larger, "I don't sleep well. There's a difference." She said, "The warehouse?" Because she'd been carrying Ciro's insinuation for 3 weeks, and it was getting heavy. His jaw tightened. "What do you know about the warehouse?" She said, "Only what Ciro told me, which you've already heard." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to confess to anything. I'm asking you to tell me what you need to so it stops sitting in the hallway between us." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I was there that night, 19 years old. My father had called me in to witness something, a meeting, a negotiation, the kind of thing he'd been including me in for 2 years, teaching me the business." His voice had gone somewhere very flat and very controlled. Acosta was at that meeting, and when the fire started, which was not an accident, which Acosta started, which 3 federal investigations never pinned on him, because he is very careful and very patient. My father stayed. He told me to get out. He stayed because he thought he could manage it, and he couldn't. And I ran because he told me to, and he died. Nora said nothing. She let the silence hold the weight of it. "Ciro's insinuation," Mateo said, "is that I knew the fire was coming, that I survived because I had advance warning and my father didn't." His voice was even and terrible. "I want you to understand that for the past 14 years I have had exactly one goal, which was finding enough evidence on Acosta to end him through channels that cannot be reversed and cannot be survived. And Ciro was my intelligence for 11 years, and he turned 8 months ago when Acosta offered him more than I could match." He set the water glass down on the doorframe. "I didn't know who you were when I found you. I want you to understand that. I found you because you were drowning, and I needed a cover, and I thought a marriage would complicate Acosta's picture of my vulnerabilities. I didn't know what you were going to—" He stopped. "What?" Nora said quietly. He looked at her. "Become," he said, after a moment that felt like a small, controlled demolition somewhere behind his eyes. She reached out and took the water glass from the doorframe because he'd clearly forgotten it was there. "Drink this," she said, "and then tell me what you actually need from me. Not the business arrangement version, the real version." He drank the water. He looked at the empty glass. "I need you to trust me," he said, "without any good reason to." "I already do," she said. "That's the problem." She went back to bed. She did not sleep for a very long time. The photograph had a second secret, and she found it on day 78. She'd gone back to the library because she did not know how to leave things alone, and she'd taken down the album again, and this time she looked at every photograph in it. 40 years of Vargas family history, stiff formal portraits and casual vacation shots, and the kind of candid images someone takes when they think no one will organize them into an archive. And she found him. In the back section, in the images from the mid-90s, before the warehouse fire, before everything. A man she recognized, older, different haircut, but the jaw was the same. Her mother's jaw, actually, was what hit her first, because she'd grown up looking at that jaw in the mirror and in the faces of everyone in her family. She turned the photograph over. Rodrigo, Elena, and Patrick, 1994. Patrick Walsh. Her father's name was Patrick Walsh. She sat down on the library floor because there was suddenly no remaining strength in her legs, and she sat there for a long time with the photograph in both hands and the full, impossible weight of it settling through her. Her father had known the Vargas family. Her father, who had disappeared when she was 12, who sent money for 3 years and then stopped, who her mother refused to discuss except in the soft, sad way of someone protecting a wound, had been photographed with Mateo's parents in what looked like someone's summer house, and everyone in the photograph was smiling. She heard very clearly in her head Mateo's voice from the contract signing. "I need someone who has nothing to lose except what I give her." And a different kind of clarity arrived, slow and devastating. He had found her, on purpose. He had known exactly who she was. She confronted him that night. She didn't plan the conversation. She walked into his study with the photograph in her hand and set it on his desk and stood in front of him and said nothing, just waited. Mateo looked at the photograph. His expression did not change. "How long?" she said. "Nora, how long have you known who I was?" He set down his pen. "Since before I approached you about the arrangement." The air went out of the room. She found it again somewhere. "You knew my father?" "Yes." "He was involved in what your family did?" "He was a contact, a legitimate one. He wasn't part of the organization. He brokered information occasionally for money. He never knew it was us specifically. The way those things work, there's insulation." Mateo's voice was careful and truthful in the specific way of someone confessing to something they have prepared for. "When did he disappear?" "Because Acosta found out." A pause. "Your father didn't die, Nora. He went into hiding. I know where he is." The room contracted around her, expanded, did both at once somehow. "You've known where my father is," she said slowly. "For how long?" 2 years. "And you didn't—" She stopped, started again. "I spent 12 years thinking he abandoned us. My mother spent 12 years. He couldn't contact you. If he had made any move toward you, Acosta would have used you to find him." Mateo's voice had gone very quiet. "He asked me 2 years ago when I first made contact to protect you without you knowing. He knew you'd fight it. He knew you were—" Another pause, different in texture. "He knew exactly who you were. He described you to me perfectly.
And instead of just protecting me from a distance, and her voice was shaking now, not from fear, but from the particular fury of someone who has been managed without consent, you married me. The threat escalated. A distance wasn't enough anymore. He met her eyes fully, and whatever else was true, she could not find a lie in his face. The silence was enormous and full of things. "You should have told me," she said. "You should have told me from the beginning." "I know." "My father." Her voice broke. She repaired it. "I need to talk to him. I can arrange that. I'm not asking for your permission." "I know," he said again, and this time it came out like an apology, like he understood that those two words were the only thing he had to offer her right now, and it wasn't close to enough.
She left the study. She did not slam the door. She closed it with the particular controlled precision of someone who has decided that falling apart in front of him is not something he gets to witness right now. She went to her room and sat on the window seat and thought about her father, alive somewhere, and her mother's sad, soft silences, and the photograph with 3 people smiling in someone's summer house, and the man in the next room who had known all of it and said nothing, and was, despite everything, the first person in years who had made her feel like she was not drowning. She was furious. She was heartbroken. She was also, and she hated this most of all, not surprised. Because she had known, somewhere below the level of her actual thoughts, that she was in the middle of something too large to see all at once. She didn't leave. She knew the reason she didn't leave was complicated and probably not fully to her credit, but she stayed. And the next morning she found Matteo in the kitchen for the first time since she'd arrived. Not his study, the actual kitchen, making coffee with the focused inefficiency of a man who did it rarely and refused to ask for help. "I want to call my father," she said from the doorway. "Tonight. I need to set up a secure line. He's being careful." "Okay." She came into the kitchen, which was hers as much as his, and poured herself coffee from the pot he'd made. "And I want full information about Acosta, not the curated version, the actual threat level and what you're doing about it." He looked at her sideways. "You're not leaving? I'm renegotiating the terms. We're not doing this as a transaction anymore. Transactions don't work when one party has been concealing material information." She held his gaze. "We're doing this as partners, which means you tell me the truth and I tell you the truth, and we stop managing each other." Matteo was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was bright with morning light and smelled like coffee and the particular stillness of 2 people arriving at something that is going to change both of them. "I don't know how to do that." "Partners." "Neither do I," she said, "but I suspect neither of us is actually worse at it than we think. We've just never tried with someone we couldn't afford to lose." He looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving in his expression that she'd never seen there before. Not the controlled version of him, not the businessman or the strategist or the man with walls so high he'd forgotten building them. Just a person, looking at another person, terrified in the quietest possible way. "Okay," he said. It was a small word. It contained everything. He called that night on the secure line Matteo set up, and the voice on the other end was her father's, older, rougher, but unmistakably Patrick Walsh, and the first thing he said was her name in the voice of a man who had been saying it privately for 12 years.
She cried. She hadn't planned to. She pressed the phone to her ear in the small room Matteo had shown her to, and let 12 years of anger and grief and confused love pour out of her in a way she couldn't have planned or managed or armored against. And her father cried too, and said things she didn't have words for yet, and she was not going to be able to describe this conversation to anyone for a very long time. Matteo did not listen in. He stood outside the door, and she heard him there, and did not ask him to leave, because she understood, without examining it, that she wanted him nearby. Afterward, she came out with her face in pieces, and he handed her a glass of water without comment. and she drank it, and he stood beside her in the hallway of the estate that she had been living in for 80-some days and had never quite allowed herself to call home. "He says thank you," she said. "He doesn't have to. He wants to. He says—" She stopped. "He says he knows you've been protecting me for 2 years in the arrangement, and he chose the right person to ask." Something shifted in Mateo's face. Small, private. "He overestimates me. He really doesn't," Nora said. And then, because she had just been cracked open by a phone call and was operating without her usual careful filters, "I need you to understand something. I know why you didn't tell me in the beginning. I understand the logic, and I'm still angry about it, and I'm going to be angry about it for a while. But I also need you to know—" She stopped, reorganized, tried again. "You have been the safest person I've known in years, and that is not something I expected to say about any man, let alone—" She gestured slightly at him, at all of him, the neck tattoo and the empire and the nightmares. He almost smiled. "The most feared man in the city? That's the one." She looked at him directly. "Don't waste it." He looked back at her, and she watched something happen in his face that had clearly been accumulating for weeks. The slow structural shift of a man realizing that the walls he built to protect himself had been keeping him in as much as they'd been keeping everything else out. "Nora," he said. "Yes? I don't know how to say this correctly. You've been doing fine. I've been doing catastrophically. And yet—" She waited. He breathed out. Then, in the particular voice he used when he had decided to be honest and had not yet accepted the consequences, "I didn't bring you here because you were Walter Hale's daughter, or because you needed saving, or because I needed cover, or I told myself all of those things, and they were all partly true, and they were also all partly excuses. Because the actual truth is that I had been watching over you for 2 years before the arrangement, and I was looking for a reason to do it properly. And when the threat escalated, I invented one, and I am not proud of that, and I don't expect forgiveness for it. But I need you to know that this—" He paused, and the word cost him something. "This stopped being a transaction before the first dinner." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said softly. "I know that." And because she was who she was, and because she'd spent years being afraid to want things, I stopped being okay with calling it a transaction about day 23. His face changed completely. The armor came off all the way for the first time, and what was underneath it was not frightening at all. It was just a man, 31 years old, with nightmares and a dead father and an enemy he'd been pursuing for 14 years, standing in a hallway at 11 o'clock at night, discovering, entirely against his plans, that he was in love. "Nora," he said again. "Come here," she said, and he crossed the 2 feet of hallway between them, and she stepped into his arms, and he held her the way he'd been holding everything in his life, like letting go would cost him everything. Except this time, the holding was the point. The threat materialized on a Thursday, 3 weeks later, at 4 in the afternoon, in the most ordinary way possible. A car parked across the street from the school where she still volunteered on Tuesdays, and a note that was left on the windshield of her car by someone who was never visible on the security footage Mateo's people pulled from the surrounding cameras. The note said, "We know she's his weakness. The deal is simple. She disappears, or she watches him disappear first." Mateo held the note for a long time. She watched him hold it. She had come directly to his study, which she did without thinking about it now, and put the note on his desk and sat down across from him, and neither of them performed any version of fine. "Acosta," she said. "Yes, you have evidence on him. Almost enough. I've been building it for 2 years. 3 more weeks, maybe 4, and I'd have everything I need to hand to the federal office that's been building the case alongside me." He set the note down. "I'm not giving him what he wants. I want you to know that. I didn't ask you to. He's going to escalate." "I know." She looked at the note. "I want to call my father. I'll set it up. And I want to know everything that's happened between you and Acosta for the last 2 years. Not summaries. Everything. Some of it is.
I said everything, Mateo. He looked at her. Then, give me an hour to prepare it. Take 2, she said, and went to make coffee, and stood in the kitchen thinking about the note, and her father hidden somewhere safe, and the 14 years Mateo had been carrying this, and the 3 weeks she needed to get through before the evidence was complete, and all the ways a person could fall in love with someone in 80-some days without either of them deciding to. He came to the kitchen 20 minutes later with a folder he'd clearly been keeping in a locked drawer somewhere. You only needed 20 minutes, she said. It was ready, he said quietly. I was waiting for the right time to give it to you. I think this might be it. She took the folder, sat down at the kitchen table, read it all. He made more coffee, and sat across from her, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and it was the most honest they had ever been with each other, and it was also the most frightened either of them had ever been, and those two things sat together in the kitchen, like old friends.
The 23 days were the longest of her life. Mateo's security was absolute and constant, and she chafed against it and accepted it and chafed against it again, and they argued about it twice and came to the same conclusion both times. She was safer if she cooperated, and he was less impossible to be around if she pushed back, and they were somehow, in these 23 days of danger and confinement and too much time in each other's company, figuring out the shape of each other. He made coffee the wrong way, and she fixed it, and he watched her do it without arguing. She read every evening in his study, and he worked, and they talked sometimes about nothing in particular, and he told her about Cartagena, where he'd grown up before his father moved the family, and she told him about the summers she'd spent at her grandmother's house in Ohio before her father disappeared and money got complicated. On day 11, she woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of his nightmares and went to the connecting door and knocked, and this time when it opened, she didn't stand in the hallway. He stood back, and she came inside and sat on the edge of his chair, and they talked until 4 in the morning about things that had nothing to do with Acosta or evidence or strategy, and at some point he fell asleep mid-sentence, and she watched him sleep, the way you watch something you are afraid of losing, and left before he woke up, so he wouldn't have to decide what to do with what it meant. But he knew. She saw him know it in his face at breakfast, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and they had coffee, and the morning that followed was the quietest and most complete thing she had experienced in years. On day 23, Mateo's contact at the federal office called at 6 in the morning to say the case was complete. By noon, the evidence had been filed. By 3, an arrest warrant had been issued. By 7, Rafael Acosta had been taken into custody outside a restaurant in the financial district, and it was over. Mateo told her in the study, standing in the late afternoon light, with the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for 14 years and has just set it down and is not yet sure what to do with his empty hands. She crossed the room and took his hands, held them. 14 years, she said. Yes, for your father. Yes. His voice was rough. And for your father. For what was done to his life because of mine. Mateo. She held his hands tighter. My father chose what he did. He knew the risks. Doesn't mean I own nothing. No, she said. It doesn't. But debts don't have to be the only reason you keep people close. He looked at her. His hands were very still in hers. Stay, he said. Where? She said, though she knew. Here. As. He paused. Not as a transaction. Not as an arrangement. As. I don't know what word. As someone you actually want. She said gently. Yes, he said. As that. She did not answer immediately. She looked at him, the neck tattoo and the careful posture, and the hands that were not actually still anymore, slightly tightened around hers in a way he probably wasn't aware of, and thought about the woman she had been 106 days ago, sitting across a desk with a pen in her hand and $50,000 and a collapsing house, and the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had been keeping everything afloat alone for too long. My mother is going to have questions, she said. I'll answer them.
She's going to be very suspicious of you. I'd expect nothing less. And my father, when this is safe enough, when he can actually come back. I know. His voice was very quiet. I know. He already knows. She looked at him. You talked to him. Last week. I wanted to do this right. The words came out slightly unpolished, which was rare for him and therefore enormous. I asked his opinion. You asked my father's opinion. she said slowly. He said. Mateo paused. He said, she doesn't need your protection. She needs someone who sees her. If you can do that, you'll be fine. Nora felt her eyes fill and did not stop them this time. He knows me, she said. He does, Mateo said. He loves you very much. He has been carrying that for 12 years, alone, in a way I recognize. She stepped into him. He put his arms around her, and she felt him breathe, actually breathe, the deep exhale of a man who has been at altitude for a very long time and has just returned to sea level. Tell me something true, she said into his shoulder, something you've never said to anyone. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the first night you were here, I sat outside your room in the hallway for 40 minutes because the house felt too empty without the sound of someone else moving through it, and I didn't know how long it had felt that way, and I didn't know what to do about it. And then I got up and went to my study because I didn't know how to be in a hallway for no reason. She pulled back to look at him. You sat in the hallway for 40 minutes on the first night. Yes, she laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her, warm and full, the first one in the estate that had cracked him open like a first window in winter. You are very strange, she said. Yes, he agreed. I'm glad, she said, and meant it completely. Her father came home 4 months later, not to the estate. That was too complicated, too much history in one room, but to her mother's house, which had been secured and maintained and quietly renovated while no one was watching. Small repairs that Mateo had arranged without discussing it, because apparently the way he loved people was through fixing their structural problems when they weren't looking. Nora stood on the front porch when the car pulled up, her mother beside her, and watched her father climb out, and look at the house, and look at her mother, and walk up the steps with the particular uncertain grace of a man who has rehearsed this arrival 10,000 times, and is discovering it is nothing like any of the rehearsals. She had arranged for Mateo to not be there, because some reunions needed to breathe without an audience. He had agreed immediately, which told her how much he understood her. She stood on the porch and watched her parents do the halting, necessary work of finding each other again after 12 years, and felt the ache of it, and the relief of it, and the gratitude for everything that had brought her to this porch at this moment. Her phone vibrated. A message from Mateo. How is it going? She typed back. It's everything. A pause. Then, good. And then, after another pause, longer, like he'd decided something between one message and the next, I love you. I've been meaning to say that clearly for about 4 months. She stood on her mother's porch with her eyes going bright, and her father visible through the screen door, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her mother's hand in his, and typed back, I know. I love you too. You should have said it 4 months ago. I was working up to it. You ended a 14-year vendetta faster than you said that. The vendetta was simpler. She laughed, alone on the porch, into the winter afternoon. Come for dinner Sunday, she typed. My mother wants to meet you. She has questions. I expected nothing less. She's going to be suspicious. I'm good at earning trust. It just takes me a while to start. She looked at the message for a moment. Then, I noticed. She put her phone in her pocket and went inside to be with her family. Her actual, complicated, scattered, slowly reassembling family, and understood that she had arrived here following the worst year of her life, through a transaction that turned into a marriage, that turned into something neither of them had planned, or expected, or known until recently. They desperately needed. She had signed a contract to save a house. She had ended up with something much harder to quantify, and infinitely more worth keeping. On Sunday, Mateo Vargas sat at her mother's kitchen table in Nora's childhood home for 3.5 hours and answered every question put to him with the particular, careful honesty of a man who had recently learned that the truth, however expensive, was the only currency that actually held its value. Her mother interrogated him for 2 of those hours. Her father nodded along from his end of the table, occasionally adding information that Mateo looked briefly pained, which Nora suspected her father was enjoying. At the end of the evening, her mother walked him to the door and shook his hand, and said, not warmly, not coldly, in the measured register of a woman who had survived 30 years and was not easily impressed, You'll do. Mateo, on his way out, looked back at Nora with the ghost smile that she had by now catalogued extensively and understood was the full version of his laugh. She walked him to his car. You'll do. She quoted at him. It's the best review I've ever received, he said, completely sincere. She kissed him, in her mother's driveway, under the November sky, and he put his hand at the back of her neck the way he'd learned she liked,
and it was entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary at the same time, the way the best things always are. She had come to a desk 1 year ago with nothing left and signed a paper she didn't fully understand. She left that driveway with a life she hadn't known to want, and a man who had spent months learning her the way he learned everything, carefully, completely, and with more feeling than he knew what to do with. She did not mind that it had taken him a while. Some things are worth the slow arrival.